back to this introduction to India and South Asia. I'm Benjamin Siegel, and I'm thrilled to have you joining me again today. Let's pick up our story again in 1772. This is 8 years after the Battle of Buxar, which saw the British East India Company taking full charge of the Indian subcontinent, or at least a small corner of it. This probably won't surprise you, but this is a time characterized by a tremendous amount of chaos. The British aren't really necessarily all that concerned about what's going on, but the board of directors of the East India Company is definitely concerned because they see it as eating away at their profit. Things are really in financial disarray. So they decide to clean things up, and so they bring in someone who they think is going to help. Warren Hastings has a long record of diplomatic and commercial service in India, and they ask Hastings to become the first Governor General of the company's Indian territories. The first thing that Warren Hastings does is to build a new capital in Calcutta. And he says that he needs to create something like an ordered system of government for British India. But this, of course, is something easier said than done. For the 13 years that Warren Hastings spent ruling British India, he had a divided council in Calcutta full of ministers who disagreed with him. And when he went back to England, he would become the subject of a major corruption trial. This became a spectacle in England, and it occupied everyone's attention as the major political scandal of the day. Today, I'm going to outline that system of governance that Warren Hastings comes up with, and then eventually how it's adapted by his successor, Lord Cornwallis. And then we're going to ask this big question: how did Britain move from controlling only a really small corner of the Indian subcontinent to ruling over the entire subcontinent by the late 19th century? It's important for us to remember just how much the British didn't know when they got to India. By the time that Warren Hastings got there in 1772, no one really knew anything except for how to be a merchant, how to do trade. All of the agents working in the company were basically traders, and they stayed more or less confined to their forts and their homes. Except for Warren Hastings and some of his colleagues, most Britons working in India didn't even know any Indian languages. There was also no precedent. There was no place elsewhere on Earth where the British were ruling over a big indigenous population so far away from home. Of course, Britain had gone elsewhere before, to the West Indies, to North America, but in those colonial encounters, they had more or less either kicked out native people or killed them and then brought in settlers from England. This time, things were going to be a little different. Things were also made more complicated by the fact that the British were eager to extend their rule, but they weren't that eager to give up all the profitable trade that they had been doing beforehand. It would lead to something of a conflict of interests. Last time, I said that the British East India Company was just that, a company learning how to rule over new territory. But around this time, there was actually a change to the structure of the company. When Warren Hastings got appointed as Governor General, the British Parliament passed a series of regulating acts. It meant that the East India Company was working more or less on the behest of the British government. And it said that the company had to serve as trustees for the people of India. This is an idea that we're going to have to unpack. Britons never thought that they were going to import British-style parliamentary democracy, or even the system that they were using in the American colonies, to India. They explained this in terms of cultural difference. British officials said that there was a fundamental difference between Indians and Britons. These were chalk and cheese. Warren Hastings explained in 1772 to the board of directors that his work was going to be to adapt our regulations to the manners and understandings of the people and the exigencies of the country, adhering as closely as we can to their ancient uses and institutions. Now, this is a crazy idea, ancient uses and institutions. It raised more questions than it answered. Were they supposed to rule like despots, as they believed that the Mughals were ruling? Were they supposed to recreate the administrative structure of the empires that came beforehand? Were they supposed to go back into time and think about all the ancient Hindu codes of practice and resurrect them for the present day? Or were they just supposed to take over and do exactly what the Nawab of Bengal was doing themselves? There were big principles at stake, and the British could only really agree on one thing. They weren't going to behave as despots. Instead, they were going to act with the rule of law, since this is what they saw as making Britain a civilized country. When the British looked at India, they had two big ideas about rule and governance that they kept in play, and these would stay really influential throughout the 18th and 19th century. The first was this idea that there was a fixed body of laws and codes, and that over time they had become corrupted by different interpreters. Warren Hastings said that he was going to work to restore the original texts of law that governed India. This was meant to free British administrators from relying too heavily on any Indian subordinates. Secondly, the British contended that there were two separate, distinct codes of laws, one for Hindus and one for Muslims. Warren Hastings said that in questions of civil suits, marriage, and inheritance, Muslims should be governed by Muslim law and Hindus should be governed by Hindu law, whatever those two terms meant. Over the late 18th century, Britons would make efforts to recover what they saw as ancient but lost lineages. This was sort of a foolish idea, though. In 1776, Warren Hastings got together a panel of Sanskrit legal scholars, or pundits, who were going to compile a code of Hindu laws. They went back to Sanskrit originals and picked out principles that suited basically their interests in the present day. And since no English person at the time really knew Sanskrit, they had them translated into Persian, and then an English translator translated them into English again. This would change within about a decade. There was a scholar named Sir William Jones who worked to master Sanskrit, and he set into motion Orientalist Scholarship. This was a work of scholarship that nominally was about the East, but it privileged a lot of different ideas that were held to be important by Brahmins over the diversity of uses that differed by caste and region. And so it gave Brahmin pundits a very important role in lawmaking in colonial India. This was also made more complicated by the fact that the English brought English case law into India. This is the system where individual suits get brought before a judge, and it replaced an Indian system where decisions were made on mediation and consensus. Warren Hastings and his fellow administrators also took the first steps towards a new system of governance in British India. It revolved around the idea of a collector, an officer who would be put in charge of a given district. This was an idea that was based upon Mughal precedent, but that system had really broken down over the time of the Bengal Nawabs. Robert Clive had believed that British officials were basically unsuited to working as district collectors. So under Warren Hastings, this role was mostly left to older Indian office holders. But by the time that Lord Cornwallis got there a bit later, right after his defeat in the American Revolutionary War, Cornwallis had become frustrated by the idea of leaving this role to Indian officers. He fired all of the Indian officials and worked to make Indians scapegoats for corruption. Every native of Hindustan, he said, is corrupt. By 1793, there was a system at work. Any appointments in the company above a certain level of pay had to be made up by British officials. This was the beginning of a fundamentally racist policy that would span almost to the end of colonial rule. But what did a collector actually do? Well, a collector collected taxes. His entire reputation was based upon his ability to bring in whatever amount of revenue that his district was supposed to get. But he also served in other roles. He acted as a local judge, he was in charge of the local police, he could decide cases in or outside of court. The collector became the most important on-the-ground figure in government. He had Indians who worked underneath him, and he responded to British superiors. This wasn't always a great role. There was an opportunity to make some money, but for the most part, these collectors didn't have a lot of independent authority, and they generally didn't move that far in the company's ranks. Eventually, they got higher salaries under Cornwallis with the idea that they would be freed from corruption. They were given pensions and eventually prohibited from working in private trade themselves. And over the late 18th century and early 19th century, collectors began to get a reputation for impartiality and being uncorruptible. Eventually, these collectors started to get more formal training. In 1802, there was a college of Fort William founded in Calcutta, and it was a place to learn local languages. In England in 1804, there was another college founded at Haileybury, and it was supposed to provide aspiring civil servants with rudimentary training in education, local customs, administration, and law before they were sent out to India. Eventually, these collectors became the backbone of the Indian civil service. They became the core officials upholding administration in British India, and many Britons, and the British, and even a number of Indians really began to take pride in this institution. You had civil administration on one side, but of course there was also the military. Throughout the 18th century, the British military in India really didn't need to do all that much. They had to beat the French and eventually to topple the Nawabs of Bengal. But then they found themselves in the position of having to defend Bengal against constant attack, and in time they would work to conquer all of India. That became a lot of work. But it was expensive to recruit Europeans to work in India, and there weren't that many in the first place. And so after the Battle of Plassey, Robert Clive began to recruit Indians as soldiers for the British military in India. These soldiers came to be known as sepoys, which is a word taken from the Persian word for soldier. Warren Hastings didn't trust any soldier who had once worked for the Nawab of Bengal, and so he began to recruit from other populations. A lot of these new soldiers came from the high-caste Hindu peasantry. They were Rajputs, they were Brahmins, all the way from Awadh to Bihar in the east. The British Indian Army was deeply worried about social upheaval, about the possibility of unrest, and so they took pains to accommodate both religious differences and also caste prohibitions. Hindus and Muslims and different castes generally didn't eat together. They didn't send Indian soldiers to work overseas. And there were a lot of Indian festivals that came to be celebrated in the military itself. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, the British Indian Army began to grow in size. By the beginning of the 19th century, it had 150,000 men working in it, an infantry arm and a cavalry arm. It had become one of the largest European-style standing militaries anywhere in the world. Mostly sepoys were content to work in the British Indian Army. They had a regular salary. Eventually there was the prospect of a pension for retirement. This was something that really wasn't true of the other local Indian militaries. And there was an effort to make Indians proud of serving in the regiment. There was the red coat, the idea that there was some kind of discipline gained in battle. This was an army working for British interests, but it was staffed mostly at the soldier level by Indians who were proud of the work that they were doing. So on the one hand, we have civil administration, taking care of daily life. There was the army and the military that was taking care of security for the British who were in India. And then there was something else. If Britain truly was going to rule in a place that was so different from what they had known before, they would need to develop a corpus of information about geography, history, and culture. Remember that this is all taking place around the time of the European Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment in Europe was characterized by this passion for knowledge, for classification, for order, for taking things that seemed immeasurable and uncountable and giving them some kind of knowability. The only way that they were going to do this in India is through a lot of studying. In 1784, there's a new institution founded called the Asiatic Society of Bengal. It's Sir William Jones, who we briefly talked about, who founds the society, and it's dedicated to studying the religious and cosmological texts that he sees as making up Indian civilization. Now it's clear to us that the Asiatic Society wasn't just discovering new things, but also really working to invent new things, to classify and to create at the same time. Part of this invention had to do with the idea of creating a shared past. In part, William Jones did this by discovering and then promoting the linguistic ties that linked India to Britain. William Jones, in his early studies, saw that among Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, there was a stronger affinity than could have possibly existed by accident. He contended, correctly, that all three of them came from a common source, which he called Proto-Indo-European. There were also new discoveries and inventions in the realm of religion. Of course, there had always been religious traditions that would appear to us now as Hindu. But it was really Sir William Jones and his friends who came to imagine Hinduism as a big cohesive body. It was really created from some of this scholarship. Sir William Jones saw Hinduism from antiquity as a repository of wisdom. And they were really mostly interested in the furthest reaches of the past, which they saw as being uncorrupted by more recent influences. But even though a lot of these were honest scholars working hard to understand what they saw as shared civilizational roots, they still believed that India was not quite as good as Europe. They all felt that while Europe had history and progress, India had a different historical arc. William Jones said that it had been a decline from a moment of ancient greatness into a time of superstition and despotic rule. This was a story that they told to help them legitimize what they were doing elsewhere, which was the work of conquest. And while William Jones and his colleagues believed that India had had a lot of valuable knowledge in literature and philosophy. Their science was basically children's science. He was dismissive of all of the accomplishments of medieval and ancient Indians. Over time, European scholars' assessment of India grew more and more critical. They found less to praise in India's knowledge systems. At the beginning, Sir William Jones's theory of linguistic ties was influential, but it gave way pretty quickly to new fixed ideas of biological race and a new theory about shared Aryan descendants who had come to India and who had mixed with indigenous Indians, who they saw as being uncivilized and barbaric. This was a way of furthering the distance between European civilization and Indian civilization. There was also a more abstract change going on, particularly in the last years of the 18th century and the first decades of the 19th. This was a moment when we saw Indian society being transformed by a broad cultural focus on information to a focus on knowledge. When the British arrived in India, they realized that it was a place that was full of information. If you went to an Indian town, there was a news writer, someone who would read the news in the public square. There was a rudimentary postal service in many places. There were people who translated texts from one language to another. The British at the beginning worked to place themselves in this information order. They put agents out in the countryside. They collaborated with informants. They had translators working themselves. They tried to learn a lot from Indians about what was going on in India. This is what later scholars would call a colonial information order, and it was really built upon Indian predecessors. But over time, there was a desire among British administrators for a more scientific understanding of India. And so book learning really came to replace these earlier thick networks of people. In 1880, there were two geographers, Colin Mackenzie and Francis Buchanan, who undertook the first major surveys of land, of crops, of castes, of family relationships all across India. In some ways, this was a great development, which helped them understand this land that they were coming to occupy. But as soon as that information was on the books, there was no need for those earlier forms of information. This was a really bad development for the British. Over time, it would leave them more vulnerable to panic, to fear, and eventually, in 1857, a major rebellion. As ideas about the division between European and Indian civilizations began to grow more entrenched, Indians and Europeans began to live very separate lives on the Indian subcontinent. In fort towns like Calcutta and Madras, the British still continued to live mostly within or around the fort, and they were protected by the military around them. In many ways, this was a constant reminder that they were in a dangerous and uncertain place. But outside of the forts, in places like Madras, there was a separate part of town clearly marked out for Indians to reside and to do work and to trade. After around 1770, as the forts became more and more crowded, the British started settling areas around the forts. They came up with big suburbs, and they erected big Greek-style mansions. In many ways for the British, working in India was the opportunity to make a lot of money. But the British were often killed by tropical diseases. If you go today to the Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta, there are lots of graves that read hydrophobia. It's a reminder that many British at the time were killed by diseases as simple as rabies. There were also many changes occurring in domestic life. In the late 18th century, nabobs and soldiers from Britain often lived openly with Indian mistresses. They called them bibis, which came from the Persian or Urdu word from wife. Many British officials, at least at the beginning of colonial rule, began to dress in Indian clothes, and they took on Indian practices. They ate Indian food. But increasingly, this social order became disturbing for Britons back in England. Many British officials had half-Indian children, and they never recognized them as British. They were stigmatized as half-castes and destined never to return to England. Over time, this became a distinct Anglo-Indian community, never fully British and never fully Indian. By the turn of the 19th century, British men were really expected to live in a smaller bungalow and shed the excesses of the past. They were also expected to come to India with a British wife, to wear British dress, and to stay away from the Indian population. Scholars used to believe that this was in fact the influence of British women, who themselves were more and more eager to go to India. But really, it seems like these changes were more wrapped up in bigger ideological shifts. Along with these new racial ideologies, there was the rise of evangelical religion, a new sense of liberalism that we're going to talk about next time, and women arriving in India were more representatives of this change than those who brought it. There's a big debate among scholars today about how different early colonial India was from its Mughal predecessor. Some of the newest scholarship suggests that these changes were actually quite small, and many vestiges of the old order still remained. The British always continued to pay allegiance to the Mughal emperor. They printed engravings of him on their coins. They used Mughal Persian as their lingua franca. They became patrons of Hindu holy sites and Muslim shrines alike. But by around 1800, it seems that many of these practices were beginning to shift. In everything from the management of holy sites to new principles of criminal law, the early 19th century was characterized by increasing rigidity and increasing order. It was a period where a lot of the flexibility of previous periods began to decline. This is also at the same time that the East India Company's army is beginning to expand rapidly. It's the rise of a really rigid modern state in India, and it set this state apart from many of its pre-colonial antecedents. We've talked about Warren Hastings and a little bit about his successor, Lord Cornwallis, and we've outlined some of the big transformations to society and governance that happened under their administrations. But now we're going to talk about the third Governor-General of India, Lord Wellesley. When he arrived in 1798, this was a moment when British India was beginning to be transformed from just one powerful player on the Indian subcontinent to the biggest player. Lord Wellesley's governor-generalship in India was the beginning of 20 years of rapid military expansion that eventually would make the British East India Company the undisputed political master of India. If we zoom out, this is a period that's defined by military conquest and new imperial enthusiasm. Back in Europe, Britain was confronting Napoleon, and its military was growing in its capacities and ambitions. Britain was emerging out of a period of struggle in Europe to a new sense that it really had the right and the capacity to rule over distant colonies. Some evidence came in the new government house that Lord Wellesley built in Calcutta. Certain members of the board of directors objected, but Lord Wellesley made the case that an expanding power needed a sign of its own strength. By the time Lord Wellesley arrived in India, there was really only one major indigenous military power left in India. That was Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan came from Mysore, and in the 1780s he had fought the British to a draw. Tipu Sultan had incredible military discipline, privateers brought from other countries, and it held out against the British for a very long time. But in spite of military strength and incredible wealth, Tipu Sultan was surrounded by British territory, and he was unable to secure support from France. In 1799, Tipu Sultan was defeated by the British army, and England went wild. One of the biggest signs of his defeat was this. It was called Tipu's Tiger. It was an 18th century automaton or early kind of robot that was carved out of wood, and it shows a tiger who's savaging a near life-size European man. Inside, there are small gears and mechanisms that make the tiger pounce and the man flail his arms. As it moves, there's a flap on the side of the tiger, and it folds down and it reveals a small pipe organ that plays a tune on 18 different notes. Tipu made this incredibly expensive and showy object to express how much he hated England. And so it's unsurprising that when he was defeated, Tipu's tiger was sent to London. It was billed as an artifact from the imperial courts of South India, and it was one of the signs that England was flexing its muscles in real ways in India. As the 19th century moved forward, Lord Wellesley began working to expand the frontier of British control. He moved northwards into the Ganges Valley, and then began incorporating the remaining Maratha territories into the empire. The Maratha Empire had declined since the height of its power, but it still had substantial military and material resources. Lord Wellesley, though, marshaled the British army to defeat the Marathas, and by 1817, most of Gujarat and Maharashtra had been added to British territory, and its royal families were turned into protected princes who were asked to uphold British rule in these newly conquered territories. This was the birth of a new political system in India, and it's either called the Subsidiary alliance system or the princely state system. It wasn't Lord Wellesley's invention. It was a system that had been devised under Robert Clive when there were small alliances drawn between the East India Company and Indian princes. The deal was a pretty simple one. The prince got protection from his internal and external enemies. He put up the money to front troops, and he accepted British residents in his court who basically served as secretaries of state. The prince got a powerful ally, and the British were able to reduce their costs of administering an increasingly large territory. It probably seemed like something of a good deal to Indian princes at the time, but really it led a lot of Indian princes to go bankrupt. The cost was really tremendous. In part, this played upon pre-existing weaknesses. When we think back to that concept of military fiscalism, we should remember that India's princes were really reliant upon bankers and financiers as they were putting up their own armies. In time, this new subsidiary alliance system really served to underwrite the decline of princely power. After 1818, much of India was actually controlled by the British, either directly or indirectly through the princes. There were only a couple of states that remained still in existence, big sprawling states like Hyderabad and the region of Sindh in the west. Princes were still useful in this late period. It was a particularly good system for the British in dry or very hilly areas that were really difficult for the British to directly administer. So places like the desert of Rajasthan or the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. Local princes had the information and knowledge needed to control these territories, pre-existing military systems, and it also helped the British hide their expanding power behind rulers who had a lot of ceremony and ritual authority. The East India Company worked to make sure that indirect rule never threatened its own authority in India. States were never allowed to hold their own independent military force, and they weren't allowed to have direct diplomatic relationships with one another. The British residents in each court picked favorites when it came time for succession. They worked really closely with bankers and financiers, and eventually they tried to train these princes into expanding Western notions of progressive liberal government. Usually princes weren't very interested in this, and they preferred to spend their time investing in education and music or the arts instead, areas where they still had some kind of autonomy. In the first 2 decades of the 19th century, India's overall economy was also being radically transformed. The East India Company continued to think of itself as basically a trading company, and it saw itself as investing in Indian goods for the British market, while developing new markets for commodities, raw cotton globally, and in China, opium. The opium trade was one of the ugliest components of British colonialism in the 19th century. The British East India Company gave advances to farmers to grow opium, they sold that opium to British traders, and then they smuggled it into China. Britain emerged in the early 19th century as the biggest drug dealer in human history. And the money that they got from the drug trade helped to prop up the company's finances when they were precarious. The opium trade also helped Britain pay for all the Chinese tea that they were importing, as it became increasingly in fashion. By the 1830s, the opium trade was making up at least 15% of the Indian government's total revenue. This arrangement, of course, would lead to 2 wars with China in the 19th century. The other big story of the India trade was that of textiles. This was a moment in history that the global balance of trade was beginning to shift. While Indian textiles had been in demand throughout the 18th century, by 1850, Indian textiles were no longer competitive in Britain, where the Industrial Revolution had taken place and where machine-made goods were now in fashion. Rather than importing textiles from India, in the early 19th century, Britain began exporting textiles, and that cloth began to saturate the Indian market. This was the moment that the Indian economy became more of a classical colonial economy, where raw materials were exported and finished goods were imported. For most Indians, this was pretty bad news. There were some new opportunities in commercial agriculture and in trade, but for most Indians, losing those earlier overseas markets was devastating. It was particularly bad for Indians who made their living from textiles beforehand, mostly weavers, and particularly in the Bengal districts of Dhaka and Murshidabad. In the countryside, a lot of skilled weavers moved away from weaving and back into subsistence agriculture. This was a backward step for much of India's economy. Another major factor that impeded the Indian economy in this period was the fact that the princely courts in India were no longer able to spend lavishly on luxury goods. This reduced consumer demand even further. This was a moment when Britain was no longer directly stealing Indian wealth, but the East India Company was basically putting a check on growth. It was also held back in this period by the fact that there wasn't a lot of good infrastructure at this time. Banks were in decline, road systems weren't very good, and so it wasn't very possible for overseas, and it wasn't very possible to invest in India. So the British basically took their money home in the form of company bonds. This was a bad economic arrangement, but it was made even worse by a new invention, which the British called home charges. This was basically taking money out of India to cover company pensions, debt, as well as the cost of maintaining offices all throughout India. In the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, India suffered a major economic depression. The value of the rupee fell, the supply of silver went down. This was in part a global crisis, but it was made much worse in India by the rise of an early colonial economy. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about colonial economic policy, but the thing that I want you to remember is that taxation in India mostly involved the taxation of land. Initially, the British didn't know anything about rural Indian society, and so their first attempts to manage revenue and to collect taxes on land under Warren Hastings involved a series of disastrous experiments. The British were so unsuccessful that they had to develop a new model. One of the biggest ideas circulating globally at this time, even though it had come from France, was the idea that all wealth was generated from land. In 1776, there was a proposal on the Bengal Council for a rule of property for Bengal. This proposal eventually came to be implemented as permanent settlement. The idea is that if you gave private property permanently to the people who owned it at the time, as opposed to the people who cultivated the land, those owners would be encouraged to invest in it. Permanent settlement was enacted in 1793 under Lord Cornwallis, and it turned out to be a terrible idea. Lord Cornwallis and other British administrators had fundamentally misunderstood what a landowner or zamindar did in India. Before the British had arrived in India, the rights associated with property were spread out. They weren't the sole domain of a single landowner, but they were dispersed among different people. So the cultivator, the landowner, and the government all had a share of the value of land. It was the zamindar who collected rent, and he passed on a lot of the remainder to the state and other actors. This was an idea that was very different from the idea of the landlord in Britain, who was supposed to invest in and then improve the land that he held. This became a major failure, and it would have consequences all throughout the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. We're going to get to them down the line. But there was also another type of settlement occurring at the same time, and that was the settlement of different roving or moving populations. In India in the 18th century, people were always on the move. Different populations rambled around different corners of India. There were herders, there were pastoralists, there were armies, there were yogis and sannyasis and other holy people who moved around the country. This was a practice that dated to antiquity, and it had stayed consistent until the 19th century. But if there's one thing that a modern state doesn't like, it's motion. For the East India Company, people moving posed a big political threat. These people were hard to observe, to monitor, and most of all, to tax. So throughout the teens and the 20s, the British worked to sedentarize or to fix into place the tribal and roving people of central India. Forest dwellers and hunter-gatherers, people who moved and occasionally raided into areas of settled agriculture, were increasingly treated like criminals. Tribal people were either confined to the forest, but then deprived of the ability to use its resources, or they were encouraged to abandon wandering for settled cultivation and agriculture. Groups like the Banjaras, who were sometimes called gypsies in the writing of the time, had always grazed their animals and they had moved it from place to place, often supporting armies or other populations. But they found that they could no longer graze their animals as lands fell under the increasingly tight control of the state. As the British disbanded private Indian armies, their work became more and more scarce. And those who continued to wander in spite of British threats came to be called criminal tribes. One of the most important criminal tribes of the 19th century emerged as an enduring myth of British India. This revolved around a group called the Thuggee, and it's where we get the English word thug. Thuggee was a group that was notorious for secrecy, and they were described by British colonial administrators as devotees of the goddess Kali. They were supposed to have a custom of ritual murder of travelers, and they did it by strangling. The idea of these roving tribes fed British fears and fantasies, and it became emblematic of an exotic India that was never going to be fully controlled. The British eventually turned this into an imaginary conspiracy, where diverse bands of highway robbers were brought into a fraternity of crime. This was really just an excuse that let the state conduct big arrests and assaults on native populations. By 1838, the British announced that Thuggee had been extirpated or fully destroyed, and this became a moment of real self-congratulation for the colonial administration. By this period, British administrators were able to see themselves as having done the impossible in India. They saw India as a pacified land. It had a law-abiding, fixed, tax-paying peasantry. But even they weren't fully aware of all the changes that were taking place, particularly in the realm of culture and religion and social organization. And as they congratulated themselves, particularly because they had moved away from information and towards knowledge, it was really difficult for them to see all the wellsprings of resentment that were growing among different Indian populations. Very soon, that would crystallize into a real rebellion. We're going to get to that next time. Thanks so much for joining me today. See you all very soon.